find out why medieval map makers filled ocean edges with monsters, and what modern psychology reveals about the hidden purpose behind those terrifying creatures.
Chapter 1. The Sanctity of Ink.
High on a harsh cliff, whipped by merciless winds, where foamy, icy ocean waves constantly crash against sharp basalt rocks like angry, condemned spirits storming the gates of heaven, the monastery of Santa Croce rises like a stone fortress of faith, and in its hidden heart, inaccessible to the profane, beats the quiet, rhythmic pulse of the scriptorium, resembling a steady, calm breathing, a sleeping, ancient giant. It is a huge, cool hall with soaring proportions, overwhelming in its majesty, where time, usually inexorable to mortals, seems to completely freeze in the thick, smelling of old wax and dust air, and every, even the thinnest ray of light has to fight an epic, silent fight against the omnipresent darkness pressing in from everywhere. The architecture of this hallowed place is an absolute triumph of the austerity of early Gothic, combined with a mystical, almost disturbing mystery, reminiscent from the inside of the cavernous interior of the monstrous chest of the biblical Leviathan, whose powerful, petrified ribs form thick stone arches and ribs of the vault, supporting on their shoulders the crushing weight not only of tons of boulders, but also of entire centuries of human history. In this sanctuary of knowledge, resembling an animated canvas pulsating with silent life of a chiaroscuro master, darkness is not just the absence of light, but an almost tangible entity, as important and full of meaning as the light itself. These deep, dramatic, even velvety shadows, which, like living creatures, hide in distant corners and niches, absorb and blur the sharp contours of oak shelves, bending with a silent creaking under the huge weight of volumes bound in darkened pigskin and calfskin. The few very narrow and high windows, topped with perfect sharp arches, let into this dark kingdom only sharp slanting spears of pale sea light, which with reverent surgical precision pick out the bent focused silhouettes of the monks from the darkness, creating luminous halos around them, in which billions of microscopic dust particles constantly dance, looking in these rays like suspended in the void, sparkling shards of pure gold. There are several dozen of them here, each dressed in the same rough, body-biting brown habit made of raw wool, each completely immersed in the absolute silence imposed by the strict monastic rule, which is so thick, so overwhelming and full of unspeakable content that it could be cut with a sharp steel knife used for trimming parchment pages, and the only thing that disturbs this absolute monastic silence is a hypnotic dry crunch of dozens of goose and swan feathers, methodically gliding over perfectly tanned hides. This constant, steady sound resembles the quiet rustle of thousands of dry autumn leaves carried by a cold November wind through a deserted forest, and is interrupted only from time to time by the distant, muffled by the thick walls, melancholy cry of seagulls that circle over the cliff like lost, damned souls searching the shores for any trace of redemption and mercy.
The air filling this large stone scriptorium is extremely heavy, saturated with an almost tangible, multi-layered mixture of specific scents, which, for the brothers working here with absolute concentration, are the scent of the Garden of Paradise itself, and for the young brother Alaric, they are even the scent of the physical presence of God himself, and proof of the sanctity of the mission being performed. First of all, it is the very sharp, astringent, and slightly metallic smell of freshly brewed gall ink, the acidic note of which bites into the nostrils, mixing in perfect harmony with the sweet, deeply calming scent of melted natural beeswax dripping from dozens of thick candles illuminating the desks in those hours when the sun hides behind storm clouds coming from the side of the restless sea. In addition, there is this one-of-a-kind, unmistakable, slightly animalistic, musky and dry aroma of old, repeatedly touched manuscripts and parchments, freshly stretched on wooden frames, preserving in their fibres not only the wisdom of ancient times, but also the prayerful efforts of generations of copyists who have long since disappeared into oblivion, leaving behind only those intricate black lines of calligraphy. Among this gathering of silent monks devoted to their work, at one of the best-lit oak desks deliberately placed near the largest of the windows, sits bent Brother Alaric, a man still young, with an ascetic long face marked by premature furrows from constant squinting and many hours of concentration, but his hands, long, thin, and with ink-stained fingers, move with an incredible, breathtaking precision, revealing the skills of an absolute master of his craft. For him, this small fragment of space around the desktop is not simply a place of physical work. It is his entire universe, his sanctuary within the sanctuary, a microcosm built entirely of smooth vellum, dozens of small bowls with colorful pigments, rows of perfectly sharpened feathers, and absolute divine order, which he tries to impose on the chaotic reality with the help of his extraordinary maps. Alaric is not an ordinary copyist, copying theological treatises or the lives of holy martyrs. He is the chief cartographer of the monastery of Santa Croce, and his current work, on which he has already spent many long, exhausting months, is a great mappa mundi, a monumental map of the world, which is not intended only to facilitate navigation in open waters, but is primarily a sacred transcription of the divine plan of creation, a graphic reflection of the order that the Creator imposed on the entire visible and invisible universe.
However, before the master cartographer even dares to touch the crystal-clear, unfilled space on the dangerous western borders of his wonderful map, before the tool, bathed in thick black, touches the parchment, Brother Alaric puts his quill down on a special brass stand for a moment, and slowly, with obvious reverence, slides off the high wooden stool to kneel on the cold, irregular stone floor that has been polished smoothly over the decades, carved by the knees of thousands of brothers praying here before him. His prayer is not loud, it is only a silent movement of his chapped lips from which flow sacred, ancient Latin formulas, merging into an intimate, incredibly passionate dialogue with God, in which Alaric asks for something much more than just the dexterity of his hands or the sharpness of his eyesight, which weakens from constant effort. He begs with all his heart for divine guidance, for spiritual clarity, and the courage necessary to be able to look into people's eyes without fear, pure terror, and render them on paper with the appropriate, blood-curdling accuracy. In his deeply grounded theological understanding of the world, the act of cartography, and in particular of drawing the monstrous creatures that inhabit the unknown depths of the oceans, is not simply an art or a science in the secular sense of these words, but is a powerful, real, and dangerous act of spiritual warfare, in which ink becomes a blessed weapon and parchment becomes the main battlefield between the life-giving forces of light and destructive darkness, between the divine order and the demonic chaos threatening to engulf civilization. As he kneels in that bright pool of pale light, with his clasped hands resting on the rough edge of the oak desk, Alaric genuinely believes that each drop of ink he precisely places on the vellum acts as a magical, unbreakable seal, a mystical glue binding malicious and demonic entities away from the trade routes and ships of Christian merchants, and that as long as his lines are careful and precise and his intentions are pure and committed, God, as long as these beastly monsters remain trapped on the dark edges of the world. So he humbly asks the Creator to allow him to see in his imagination what is hidden from mortal sight, to sharpen his senses to the terrifying hidden truths about the depraved nature of fallen creation, to be able to draw beasts so terrible that no sailor, looking at this map in the future, will ever dare to sail beyond the designated safe limits of human dominion.
The map itself, spread out on an impressive carved tabletop in front of the eyes of the praying Alaric, is a true miracle of medieval calligraphy and illumination. A priceless and masterful work that in its extremely complex geometric beauty is a perfect manifestation of the heavenly harmony hidden under the cloak of a superficially chaotic physical world. And its rigorous composition is based on the classical arrangement in which all known land was inscribed in a perfect mystical circle symbolizing the divine infinity and the inviolable cyclicality of time. In the heart of this extraordinary representation of the earthly valley, precisely in the geometric center of the sacred circle, shines like the true precious jewel of Jerusalem, the ultimate navel of the world, the city of cities to which from every corner of the continents lead invisible threads of powerful spiritual longing. And Alaric has devoted the entire past weeks to making it the undisputed visual and spiritual anchor of the entire composition, covering miniature, intricate turrets and the bulging temple domes with the purest 24-karat gold leaf. Applying this wonderful gold was an almost alchemical process, requiring the monk to completely hold his breath with every, even the slightest movement of the rabbit hair brush, so that the slightest gust of air exhaled from the lungs would not blow away the microscopic flakes of the precious metal, as airy as the morning fog, which now, carefully arranged on a carefully prepared base of sticky red bowl clay and extract of the juice of garlic, reflect the light coming through the window with such magical intensity that the city seems to pulsate with its own life. Around this radiant, sacred center of the world are the carefully plotted vast lands of Europe, Asia, and Africa, arranged in a logical, harmonious order, separated from each other by blue winding ribbons of rivers and calm internal seas, on whose territories Alaric, with incredible attention to the smallest details, placed tiny red and blue silhouettes of soaring cathedrals, fortified with stone-walled cities, dense forests, and massive mountain ranges. However, the further the gaze sweeping over the parchment moves away from this golden, safe center, the closer it comes to the rounded edges of leather surrounded by the vast ocean surrounding everything, the more this calming, joyful, and geometric order begins to break down dramatically, giving way to something untamed and disturbing. The famous names of cities irretrievably disappear, and in their place appear the thick waters of the ocean, which for Alaric is not simply water, but a dark territory of monsters, terrifying bestiae maris.
To convey with terrifying fidelity the true diabolical nature of these dangerous sea horrors, Alaric cannot rely solely on the ordinary dark gal ink or the cheap faded ochres used by second-rate copyists. He needs colors that will strike the soul of the future viewer with the force of a sudden lightning strike. So now, with slow, deeply meditative precision, he proceeds to grind the raw pigments in a small porphyry mortar. He focuses all his attention on creating the perfect red, vibrating with a dark shade of congealed blood, intended specifically to fill the gaping, insatiable mouth of the giant Leviathan. And for him, this physical process of preparing bright paints is a kind of art of alchemy, an almost magical ritual of transforming dead, brutal matter extracted from the bowels of the earth into pure, luminous beauty capable of transferring the revealed truths of faith on parchment. He carefully pours into a stone bowl small shimmering lumps of cinnabar imported from distant sunburned Spain, a blood-red mineral of mercury sulfide about which there are dark legends circulating in the closed walls of monasteries, that it is highly toxic not only to the bland human body, but also to the immortal soul of the careless painter, and slowly, evenly begins to grind it with an extremely heavy brass pestle.
With each steady, practiced movement, with each dry grinding of stone against stone, the hard red lumps mercilessly crack and crumble into thousands of pieces, slowly turning into an impossibly fine, bright powder that seems to glow with its own internal and disturbing light in the cool twilight of the great scriptorium. And this mechanical, monotonous sound of grinding acts on Alaric's tired mind like a deep, hypnotic trance, allowing him to completely cut yourself off from the physical world. When the pigment reaches the desired satisfactory consistency of the finest dust, the monk adds a bit of a perfectly transparent binder prepared from beaten egg white, commonly called glaire, and one crystalline drop of pure spring water, and then, using a tiny spatula carved from bone, combines these ingredients into a smooth, shiny, bloody paste, resembling thick ichor extracted straight from the beating heart of some mythical, cruel beast ready to devour entire armadas of ships.
However, before the application of this terrifying color to the parchment begins in earnest, Alaric, tired of many hours of sitting in one stiff position, allows himself a rare moment of physical respite, carefully puts the heavy mortar on the counter, stretches his aching, stiff fingers that squirm silently in the overworked joints, and slowly rises from his seat to approach the high, arched window cut in the 2-cubit-thick stone wall, from where offers a stunning view of the endless ocean. He looks down into the real foaming abyss of the sea that continually crashes against the black, sharp rocks with a fury and a dull roar, like the roar of 1,000 wild lions, and his tired eyes, so used to analyzing the fine, precise lines on light vellum, now greedily take in this huge, stark, gray-green, stormy void, stretching discouragingly into the hazy, a blurred horizon, where the stormy sky merges with the water. This physical water, observed from above, seems completely, even painfully empty, devoid of any visible traces of monstrous tentacles or enormous fins, which to a simple mind could be proof that the monk's work with monsters is only a figment of fantasy. But Alaric's mind operates in another, deeply theological reality, in which this superficial emptiness of the ocean outside the window is not a denial of the existence of leviathans and sea serpents, but a powerful proof of their mastery in hiding in the dark depths. He believes with absolute, even fanatical conviction that these monsters are down there, in the dark, icy Mariana trenches of his world, patiently sleeping and waiting, hidden by God himself from the eyes of fools and infidels, like sleeping volcanic mountains that will wake up and explode in anger only when human pride dares to violate the sacred boundary set by the Creator. And he, Alaric, is the only visionary who was allowed to see this hidden, toothed dimension of truth.
At the center of his artistic endeavors today is the majestic and primal awe of the Leviathan, a gigantic creature from the darkest of sea legends, which Alaric precisely places on the westernmost, extremely dangerous edge of his intricately woven map, just beyond the fabled and infamous Pillars of Hercules, where the turbulent waters of the ocean are said to become as hot and thick as boiling pitch, and the wind completely ceases to blow in the sails of the unfortunate ships. The visual concept of this particular beast did not spring into his mind out of nowhere, but is a complex, carefully crafted amalgamation of many hours of nightly study of the dusty, fragile scrolls of the prophet Isaiah, the ancient treatises of Pliny the Elder on the wonders and anomalies of nature, repeatedly rewritten and censored bestiaries, and his own fever dreams, induced by austere monastic fasting, in which he saw scales harder than ever before. The purest steel. With awe and fear, Alaric molds the anatomy of this magnificent creature, giving it a serpentine body,
woven into powerful, muscular weaves capable of crushing the oak frames and masts of the largest warships with one murderous grip, covering these deadly weaves with hundreds of meticulously shaded scales, each of which is painted individually, one after the other, with the same repetitive attention with which the monk recites more beads of a rosary made of holy wood. With each precise stroke of the delicate pen, a new, deadly sharp spike grows on the monster's back. On the surface of the light vellum, webbed fins resembling the wings of a hellish bat grow, and this whole macabre chimera, born of ink and fear, takes on an incredible, even terrifying three-dimensionality, seeming to float above the flat surface of the map like a real bloodthirsty deity of angry waters, constituting a living barrier stopping endless chaos from pouring into the orderly garden of Christian Europe.
Finally, the most crucial, most intimate, and spiritually dangerous moment of the entire arduous creative process arrives. The moment that, according to the monk's personal mystical belief, breathes real life into the painted illusion. Alaric slowly reaches for his thinnest, most expensive brush, made of carefully selected single hairs from the tail of a Siberian ermine embedded in a goose feather, to paint the eye of the Leviathan, the focal point of the dark soul of this beast. The execution of this one particular detail requires absolute, almost inhuman physical calm. For those few beats of a decelerating heart, Alaric literally stops breathing, his chest freezes, and his entire consciousness narrows to the tip of this tiny brush, on which vibrates one perfectly spherical, jet-black and shiny drop of the highest quality bone-black ink, which seems to greedily absorb all the light around it. When the tip of the brush finally, gently, with barely perceptible resistance, touches the rough surface of the vellum in the place previously designated as the beast's pupil, the drop instantly flows from the bristles and sinks into the fibers of the parchment, creating a perfect, smooth spot in the center of which, thanks to the humidity of the ink and the sun shining through the window, a microscopic, shiny white reflection appears, giving the terrifying illusion of a sudden, a predatory, and very lively gleam in the sea monster's huge eye. In that split second, as the ink slowly dries on the leather, Alaric has the terrifying, goosebump-provoking feeling that the eye on the parchment suddenly opens with a malicious click, that it is not he who is looking analytically at the drawing, but that it is the monster he has just drawn, staring at him from the depths of the paper ocean, piercing his immortal soul with a gaze full of eternal, icy hatred, thus confirming the importance of the monk's mission to trap this destructive force within the black spot of ink.
Carefully studying the wide, richly decorated margins of his still unfinished map, those unexplored territories shrouded in the horror of sea stories colloquially called terra incognita and mare tenebrosum, Alaric immerses himself in deep reflections on the theological and moral significance of boundaries in human cognition, boundaries that he considers as real, physical, and inviolable as the thick stone walls surrounding his centuries-old safe mother monastery. For him, the ominous inscription Hic sunt Draconis, placed in elegant black Gothic capitals on the empty western expanses of the world ocean, is not just a decorative filler of empty space on parchment, nor a humble expression of the helpless ignorance of the old masters of cartography, but is the most important, the loudest lesson of humility, thrown straight into the face of the proud, sinful humanity, demanding for itself the impudent right to exploring every part of the globe, despite God's prohibitions. In his simple but profoundly noble and Christian compassion, the monk genuinely empathizes with the unknown sailors, traders of precious spices, brave explorers and captains of storm-ravaged caravels who struggle with the waves far from the warmth of home. He sees himself as their unseen monastic protector, a spiritual beacon of dye and ink who will mercifully turn them back with his visual warnings, ships from their disastrous path. He imagines that somewhere on the stormy, icy waters of the Atlantic, an experienced captain leans over a copy of his map in the light of a rickety lantern, sees those intricately drawn monstrous claws and gaping jaws of the beast, feels a shiver of religious horror, and makes the only right decision to order a change of course towards the safe shores of Europe, which makes his cartography, in the monk's eyes, become the highest moral compass of the era, a powerful barrier woven from holy fear, carrying the promise of saving souls.
As the hours of silent work, filled with endless, exhausting concentration, pass, the temperature in the unheated, cavernous scriptorium begins to drop inexorably and dramatically, and a moist, piercing cold creeps into the stone interior, blowing straight from the stormy sea, which mercilessly penetrates the stiff woolen materials of the habits and penetrates straight into the joints of the monks leaning over the desks, forcing them to feeling severe physical discomfort. From time to time, you can only hear how one of the brothers puts down his bird's feather with a quiet, barely audible groan to vigorously rub his hands, which are numb and resistant to the intense cold, or how he blows loudly on his blue fingers, trying to breathe back into them the warmth and circulation necessary to maintain an impeccable grip learned over the years on the thin, slippery handle of the writing instrument, from which the quality and precision of the drawn initials and land contours absolutely depend on it. Apart from these small, physiologically necessary breaks, there is an indivisible, almost magical synergy of action in this large, dark Roman Catholic hall, a kind of ineffable, powerful brotherhood forged in absolute silence, piercing cold, and common voluntary suffering for a higher religious goal, without speaking words to each other, the brothers communicating wonderfully through the very steady rhythm of their Benedictine work, creating a perfect mechanism of prayer combined with scraping bookbinding knives on vellum. For the talented Alaric, this atmosphere of collective, silent effort is like the most wonderful, multi-voiced, polyphonic mass sung in the hearts to the glory of the Creator, where every pain of the unnaturally bent spine and every painful burning of the eyes staring at small details are treated not as a reason for human complaint, but as small, extremely valuable sacrifices that he, as a faithful servant, proudly and humbly offers on the carved altar of his endless faith in the principle of sacred work.
As the precise strokes of a delicate brush and pen fill the white void of the parchment with successive terrifying, sea-like anomalies born in the darkest recesses of the human subconscious, the soul of Brother Alaric, in paradoxical opposition to the panic-inducing visions, is overcome by a feeling of extremely deep, unshakable peace, a state of divine grace and a sense of life fulfillment that many a powerful ruler sitting on his throne would undoubtedly envy. With each flawlessly painted razor-sharp tooth of the monster, and with each treacherous whirlpool marked with masterful skill, his burning faith in the absolute, geometric, and inviolably moral order of the cosmos, precisely designed and ruthlessly controlled by the Almighty God, is further powerfully strengthened, giving him a sense of 100% certainty of the purposefulness of his own humble existence within the monastery walls as the chosen chronicler of miracles. All this sublime poetic piety of the monk and his mystical, beautiful sense of fulfilling the noble duty of stopping sailors from perishing at sea, however, carries the burden of a powerful, invisible to the cartographer trapped in dogmas, tragic irony, which hangs over the entire Christian Europe like a thick, stormy cloud. Alaric has not the slightest idea that the entire foundation of his extraordinary work is carefully and cynically crafted, a big lie constructed by the elites.
The monsters he draws with such a tremor of his heart, this whole institutionalized map-based theology of fear, are in fact an absolutely perfidious political tool deliberately used by the highest church hierarchies and rulers to deliberately paralyze commercial competition, discourage countries from independent exploration of the West, and maintain a lucrative monopoly on geographical knowledge, making the unsuspecting Alaric an outstanding creator of chains that enslave human curiosity.
With the inevitable slow rotation of the Earth, the huge disk of the fading sun finally begins to approach the jagged horizon outside the monastery walls, and the nature and direction of the light entering through the high windows into the dark scriptorium undergo a radical, highly dramatic change, instantly transforming this ascetic space into a dark theatrical scene taken from the canvases of the most outstanding creators of the art of dark chiaroscuro. The spears of the previously pale glow, now in the late afternoon hours, take on an exceptionally deep, saturated, rusty orange color, falling into the room at a sharp, almost horizontal angle, causing every smallest object on the table to cast unnaturally long, distorted shadows on the stone surface of the walls, slowly creeping like black tar snakes, threatening to completely devour the intricate details on the carefully crafted walls parchments of hard-working monks spread out on all the desks. This fascinating and at the same time slightly eerie phenomenon of the play of fading light has an incredible, almost magical effect on the beasts precisely drawn by Alaric in the shimmering glow of thick wax candles slowly lit on the desks, vibrating from the draught. The monstrous shapes of the leviathans seem to truly come to life. Their scaly weaves, intertwined with the waves, begin to elusively writhe and wave on the parchment, as if the trapped demons were trying to furiously break the bonds of ink under the cover of the approaching night, which orders the monk to immediately end his work. Suddenly, cutting through the thick silence of the scriptorium with the brutal, sobering force of a thunderclap, the deep, resonant roar of the mighty cast-iron bell from the main tower rings out, heralding the approach of vespers and marking the irrevocable end of the day's work, drawing Alaric's mind, drifting in the afterlife, from the realm of imagination back to the rigorous reality of discipline, where the monks synchronously put down their pens and begin a silent ritual of cleaning sticky ink from tools. Before leaving the sanctuary to the singing of the chorale, Brother Alaric allows himself one last, intimate look at the Mappa Mundi composition lit by flickering candlelight, feeling a wave of overwhelming crystal-clear and religious peace, and then, tightly wrapped in the belief of the great protective importance of his ink guardians, protecting the sailors from destruction, he extinguishes the candle flame and disappears into complete darkness to serve God in choir.
Chapter 2. Abbot's Blessing.
The time spent in the dark, icy corridor outside Abbot Theron's private office seemed to Alaric an eternity, stretched to the limits of human endurance by the powerful, irregular beats of his own heart, which, like a blacksmith's hammer, pounded against his ribs, threatening to burst his chest. He stood in deep shadow, surrounded by the austere, bare walls of the monastery, from which the cold of centuries emanated, penetrating the thin material of his habit to the very bones. The heavy oak door separating him from the highest authority in their closed world resembled a gate to the afterlife rather than an entrance to a place of learning. Its surface was covered with intricate carved reliefs depicting scenes of the Last Judgment, where the damned contorted their faces in silent screams as they were dragged into the abyss by horned beasts, which intensified the already suffocating feeling of fear and uncertainty in the young cartographer's soul.
the leather tube that held his life's work, a nearly completed map of the world, the product of countless sleepless nights and burnt-out candles, slithered in his sweaty hands as he tried to calm his breathing, inhaling the heavy air filled with the scent of burnt myrrh, damp stone, and old wax. Every little noise, every crack of the torch burning down in the corridor, casting long, distorted shadows across the ceiling, made Alaric tremble, fully aware that this encounter would decide not only the fate of his map, but his own place in the strict hierarchy of monastic life, where the slightest mistake could mean a charge of heresy, or worse, blasphemous pride.
When at last he heard the abbot's muffled, hoarse voice allowing him to enter, the sound of a bolt being released was like the sound of a crypt being unlocked, and the mighty oak door gave way with the long, sullen creak of iron hinges, admitting him into the sanctuary of shadows and secrets, where the fate of knowledge and faith was being decided. As Alaric crossed the threshold, he immediately felt the oppressive weight of the atmosphere in Faron's office. It was a vast but claustrophobic room, bathed in inky blacks and dramatic shadows reminiscent of the darkest works of chiaroscuro masters. The walls disappeared behind towering black wood shelves that were heavy with forbidden books, bound in faded leather and secured with rusting iron clasps and chains, as if they contained truths too dangerous to be allowed to freely see the light of day. The air was filled with a thick, suffocating smell of decaying parchment, dried ink and beeswax, creating a specific incense of academic obsession and theological rigor. In the center of this gloomy kingdom, behind a huge table resembling a sacrificial altar, sat Abbot Theron. His silhouette, wrapped in robes of deep saturated crimson and black, almost blended with the surrounding darkness, making him an integral part of the shadow. The only source of light in the room was a single, thick candle placed on the edge of the table, whose quivering flame revealed only fragments of the superior's severe ascetic face from the darkness, emphasizing the sharp features of his cheeks, deep-set eyes, and pursed lips, giving him the appearance of a merciless judge from ancient legends. Alaric, paralyzed with respect mixed with subcutaneous terror, had the impression that it was not a man sitting before him, but an animated monument embodying the absolute, unquestioned power of the institution they both served. And in the semi-darkness of the room, every breath seemed as loud as the tolling of a bell, intensifying the aura of Gothic mystery and all-encompassing fear. With trembling hands, clumsy with nerves, Alaric pulled the parchment from the leather tube and began to slowly unfold it on the smooth, polished oak desk, careful not to damage the fragile material he had worked on for so many painful months. The sound of rustling, stiff vellum cut through the deathly silence of the office like a crack of ice on a frozen lake, and when the map finally unfolded in its full glory, its surface immediately came to life in the warm glow of the flickering candle, revealing an amazing, almost hypnotic spectacle of colors and shapes. The saturated colors, carefully ground from the most precious minerals and rare plants, seemed to pulsate with a life of their own. The cobalt blues of the deep oceans, obtained from powdered lapis lazuli from the Far East, contrasted with the deep crimsons of the danger zones and the polished, shining gold leaf with which Alaric decorated the wind roses and the crowns of the sea beasts. Every detail, from the jagged shorelines to the intricate scales of the monsters emerging from the waves, was proof of his artistic obsession and unwavering faith. But in the presence of the silent abbot, it all suddenly seemed fragile and insufficient to Alaric, as if he was bearing not only his skills, but also the innermost recesses of his soul before a harsh tribunal. The boy stood still, holding his breath, the candlelight reflecting in his wide, tense eyes as he desperately tried to read Theron's half-shadowed face for any sign of acceptance, or worse, growing condemnation of his daring deed.
The silence that followed the unfolding of the map was thick, heavy and tangible like a physical object, tightening around the young monk's throat like a hangman's noose and stretching each passing second indefinitely. Abbot Theron didn't say a word, his deep-set, dark eyes reflecting the tiny candle flames as they methodically, inch by inch, scanned the vast surface of the vellum, examining every outline, every drop of ink, and every gilded detail with the intensity of a predator assessing its prey. This prolonged silence was a tool of power, a deliberate ploy to crush his subordinate's self-confidence, forcing Alaric to frantically mentally analyze every brushstroke, every artistic decision, wondering whether the theological meaning of his monsters had not gone one step too far towards blasphemy. The chiaroscuro falling on the superior's face, highlighting the deep lines around his mouth and the dark circles under his eyes, gave him the appearance of an ancient prophet hunched over the scrolls of fate, which made Alaric feel not like a creator, but like a sinner awaiting judgment, and with each beat of his heart, his hands, hidden in the sleeves of his habit, clenched tighter and tighter until his ankles ached.
Only after several long, crushing minutes of absolute silence, during which Alaric managed to silently say goodbye to his ambitions, did the abbot's pale hand, marked by age and liver spots, slowly, almost theatrically, emerge from the folds of the heavy black fabric. She approached the surface of the map like a bird of prey descending over the surface of the water, and her long, bony index finger, ending in an unnaturally sharp, yellowed fingernail, fell to the lower right corner of the vellum, where Alaric had painted some of his most terrifying creations. The abbot's fingernail began slowly tracing the intricate contours of a monstrous, serpentine beast emerging from the depths of the sea, and the sound of the scratching, quiet, dry, and disturbing, sent a shiver of fear through Alaric, as if his own skin was being rigorously examined. Theron pressed down on the parchment with a surprising hidden force, leaving behind his finger a visible indentation, a clear, physical trace of domination over the work and its creator, symbolically marking that although Alaric was the craftsman, the abbot was lord and ruler of the very meaning of what was drawn. This slow, meditative, and yet brutal in its precision gesture made the monster on the map suddenly seem real, brought to life by the touch of power, and all the attention in the dark room focused on that single, dented point on the animal's stretched skin. The abbot's voice, when it finally broke the heavy silence, was a low, deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the wooden panels of the walls and resonate within Alaric's very chest, echoing from the very bottom of an ancient well. "These are not simply beasts, my son," Theron said, without taking his eyes off the parchment, his tone devoid of anger, replaced by a dark academic fascination combined with a chilling authority. "Your monsters are not mere decorations, they are pigmented sermons, delivered without words to the souls of those who would dare to question the order of creation." These words, spoken with absolute, unwavering conviction, hit Alaric like a revelation, changing the nature of the entire encounter. What he had considered an artistic expression and technical triumph of his craft was suddenly elevated to the rank of the highest theological service, an instrument in the hands of God himself. The abbot finally looked up, and his dark eyes, shining in the twilight next to the burning candle, seemed to penetrate the monk's soul, conveying to him the weight of the dark philosophy that art and fear were inseparable twins, created to keep the fragile human nature in line with obedience and humility before the unfathomable power of the Creator and his earthly vicars.
The abbot continued his speech, rising slowly from the heavy carved chair, and his figure immediately grew in size before Alaric's eyes, casting a huge, menacing shadow on the opposite wall that seemed to consume half the room. "You must understand, Brother Alaric, the nature of human pride and the nature of chaos," Theron said, walking slowly around the desk as the candlelight caught the reflection of the golden cross hanging on his chest. "The vast, untamed ocean, these endless dark waters that you have so carefully outlined, are the physical manifestation of that chaos, the original disorder from which God emerged the world and to which sinful man constantly desires to return through his disobedience and lust for unlimited knowledge. The beasts you have placed here with such terrifying precision serve as heavenly guardians against the human hybris. They tell man how far God allows him to go, marking the final boundary between the safe world of Christian order and the absolute nightmare of destruction and eternal damnation." The abbot spoke with an almost fanatical but controlled passion, and his face, lit from the side, became a mask with two faces. One belonged to a pious shepherd protecting his flock from evil, the other to a cold, pragmatic tyrant who perfectly understood the mechanisms of psychological control over the crowd.
The abbot's finger moved in a fluid motion across the width of the ocean, finally stopping and striking hard at a specific point on the map, just off the jagged, dangerous coastlines of West Africa, where Alaric had painted a massive, multi-headed hydra, its serpentine bodies tangled in a murderous embrace, its scales gleaming in the light in alternating shades of rotten green and crimson red. "This particular beast," Theron said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his thin, pursed lips that held no trace of joy, only the cold calculation and dark satisfaction of a player making a winning move. "This one is exceptionally effective. Its multi-headed nature perfectly illustrates the multitude of dangers awaiting heretics and smugglers. She will keep God-fearing, simple people on the right path, dissuading them from trying to find their own way south, away from the ports controlled by Holy Mother Church." In that precise indication, in that small calculating smile of the abbot, hid the dark secret of the policy of the entire empire. Alaric's monsters would serve not only as a theological warning, but as a very real economic and political tool of terror, intended to divert extremely profitable trade routes straight into the monopoly of the monastery and its allies, securing the power of earthly power under the cloak of divine wrath. An immediate, overwhelming wave of incredible, hot pride surged inside Alaric, completely washing away the previous paralyzing fear and uncertainty that had choked him since he entered that dark room. The young cartographer, naive in the affairs of the great world, absorbed every word spoken by the abbot like a thirsty wanderer drinking water from a holy spring, interpreting them only through the prism of his deep religious piety and artistic vocation. He saw in his superior's words the final irrefutable validation of his life mission, his months of isolation, his fingers bleeding from precise work, his eyes going blind in the darkness. All this suddenly took on a cosmic, sacred meaning. He was blind, completely and hopelessly blind to the subtle manipulation, to that cold gleam in Theron's deep-set eyes, and to the fact that the proper paths the abbot spoke of were ordained not only by the unfathomable will of God, but above all by very powerful, ruthless men who wanted to maintain a monopoly on the riches of this world.
The monk's heart was filled with euphoric gratitude, and the feeling of being the chosen vessel of Providence completely clouded his critical judgment, closing his mind to any shadow of suspicion about the true worldly intentions of his arch-powerful principal.
The meeting was drawing to a close, and the thick, heavy atmosphere in the office began to subside slightly as Abbot Theron stepped back into the shadows, tearing his gaze from the vellum and thus relieving Alaric of his overwhelming attention. With a short, imperious movement of his hand that brooked no opposition or delay, the superior signaled that the audience was over, finally allowing the young monk to breathe deeply without fear of committing indiscretion. Alaric, his hands still shaking slightly, but this time with elation rather than terror, began methodically, reverently rolling the parchment, trying to make each movement respectful of the work that had just been blessed and anointed for higher, holy purposes. The cold and darkness of the room no longer seemed threatening or hostile in his pride-altered perception. Those deep shadows and the smell of decaying books became a natural, safe sanctuary of knowledge, a fortress from which he himself, a poor cartographer, would release into the world a powerful instrument of divine discipline. Placing the map back in its hard leather tube, he bowed deeply, almost to the ground, before the silent, dark figure of the abbot, feeling the weight of responsibility rest on his shoulders like a royal mantle.
The abbot nodded slightly, his expression returning to an unreadable, stern mask as the shadows once again engulfed his sharp features in the light of the lone candle. Slowing his pace, Alaric retreated towards the heavy oak door, his every move now seeming more confident, rooted in a newfound sense of self-worth and purpose. As he grabbed the cold iron handle and pulled the door open, the creak of the hinges no longer sounded like a warning of hell, but like a solemn fanfare announcing his triumph, and the cool air of the corridor hit his face like a refreshing breeze from the open sea. When the door finally closed behind him with a dull, final click, separating him from Theron's penetrating gaze, Alaric let out a long, vibrating breath, letting the pent-up tension leave his muscles and melt into the dimness of the monastery's corridors. As Alaric walked down the long, dark corridor back to his humble scriptorium, he felt as if he were floating inches above the cold stone slabs of the floor, his step quick and energetic, fueled by the volcanic energy of renewed faith and absolute conviction in the righteousness of his actions. The darkness surrounding him on all sides, broken only by the rare, flickering points of the torch, was now a drastic contrast to the bright, blazing light that illuminated his own soul, filled to the brim with the sense of fulfilled duty and holy calling. With each step his heart swelled with pride, and the vision of the monsters he had created, these magnificent bloodthirsty guardians of divine order, filled him with joyful ecstasy, confirming in his belief that he was not only an artist, but a true soldier of faith, fighting chaos with brush and pigment. The tragic irony of this moment, the dramatic gap between his pure spiritual naivety and the cynical dark politics of Abbot Theron, remained completely hidden from his fascinated mind, which refused to see that the pigmented sermons were intended not to save souls, but to fill the monastic treasuries with the gold of those who, out of fear, would choose the paths marked out by the merciless rulers of this world. And so, wrapped in the illusion of his own holiness, Alaric slowly disappeared into the deep shadows of the monastery, carrying with him a map that would forever change the fate of countless sailors trapped in the web of monsters born of his talent and the greed of others.
Chapter 3. A Sailor's Ghost.
The descent into the subterranean archive always felt to Alaric like a deliberate interment, a willing burial away from the celestial, divine light of the upper scriptorium, where the holy texts were meticulously illuminated in blinding gold and vibrant lapis lazuli. Down here, beneath the foundations of the abbey, the air was permanently stagnant, overwhelmingly heavy with the suffocating, powdery scent of desiccated leather, crumbling vellum, and the slow, inevitable decay of centuries of forgotten human thought. A single razor-sharp shaft of harsh afternoon sunlight managed to pierce the oppressive, tenebrous gloom, slicing diagonally down from a narrow iron-grated clerestory window set high near the vaulted ceiling. This lonely beam of illumination did not serve to brighten the cavernous room. Rather, it functioned only to starkly highlight the swirling, chaotic galaxy of dust motes that danced endlessly in the stagnant air, suspended like microscopic drifting constellations in an otherwise pitch-black, forgotten universe. Alaric, draped in the heavy, rough-spun dark wool of his strict monastic order, stood at the center of this shadowy vault, tasked with the mind-numbing, entirely mundane duty of cataloging an endless, chaotic mountain of donated manuscripts. These documents were the literary remnants of recently deceased brothers and minor provincial benefactors, a veritable graveyard of theological ephemera that the powerful abbots deemed too trivial to display in the grand library, yet too inherently sacred to unceremoniously burn. As he shifted a particularly massive, rotting ledger bound in cracked, moisture-warped pigskin, a sudden billowing cloud of ancient gray dust erupted directly into his face. He squeezed his eyes shut tightly, his entire body convulsing as a violent, wholly undignified sneeze echoed sharply off the cold, damp stone walls, utterly shattering the reverent, deathly silence of the subterranean chamber. The sudden explosive sound reverberated aggressively in the vaulted ceiling overhead, a harsh, intensely human intrusion into a liminal space that belonged entirely to ghosts, lingering shadows, and the relentless slow degradation of relentless time. He wiped his nose harshly with the rough, scratchy sleeve of his habit, his eyes watering profusely, quietly cursing the microscopic abrasive particles that seemed maliciously intent on permanently coating his lungs. The sheer physical discomfort of the tedious task was immense. His lower back ached with a dull, throbbing pain from hours of hunching over the makeshift, uneven cataloging table. His sensitive fingers were permanently stained with the ghostly residue of cheap, flaking ink, and the chilling subterranean dampness of the unforgiving stone floor seeped steadily upward through the thin, worn leather soles of his sandals, settling deep into his bones like a permanent, unyielding frost. Yet, despite the agonizing physical toll and the sheer banality of the labor, Alaric historically endured this tedious penance with a quiet, submissive grace, genuinely believing that absolutely every piece of written word, no matter how seemingly trivial, was a tiny, vital fragment of the Creator's incomprehensibly grand design, a humble testament to the supreme divine order that he himself so meticulously and devotedly painted on his own magnificent world-encompassing maps in the brightly sunlit chambers far above his head. His current focus was a particularly heavy, entirely unremarkable psalter that had been recovered from the meager personal effects of a remarkably obscure, silent brother from a distant coastal monastery. The heavy book's thick wooden covers were grotesquely warped by years of ancient, unseen dampness. The blind-tooled leather exterior cracked and fissured like a parched, desolate riverbed suffering under a merciless summer sun. The heavy iron clasps, designed to keep the vellum pages compressed and flat, had rusted entirely.
As Alaric mechanically began to turn the stiff, heavy folios, checking for marginalia or hidden prayers, his highly sensitive fingers, soft and calloused only by the gentle, repetitive friction of goose-feather quill and smoothing pumice stone, abruptly detected a distinctly discordant, abrasive texture. tucked securely and deliberately between the mournful, pleading verses of the Psalms of Lamentation, completely concealed from casual observation, lay a folded piece of remarkably coarse material. It was undeniably not the carefully prepared, smooth calfskin or sheepskin of the sacred scriptorium, but something significantly cheaper, significantly coarser, and clearly battered by relentless exposure to unforgiving elements. The harsh rustle it made as he carefully, tentatively touched it was startlingly loud, a profane, hissing whisper against the heavy, sacred silence of the subterranean room. With meticulous, agonizingly slow precision, fearing that the mysterious, anomalous insert might crumble into useless ash at his very touch, Alaric extracted the folded document from its holy hiding place. The sheer oddity of finding a mundane, folded piece of what appeared to be common utilitarian paper hidden so deliberately within the protective embrace of a highly sacred text sent a preliminary, involuntary shiver of undefined apprehension racing down his rigid spine. Unfolding the stiff, resistant document was a tense, delicate operation. The thick parchment fought back slightly, having been tightly pressed into its small, concealed, folded state for years, perhaps even decades, by the immense weight of the holy book. As the parchment finally yielded and spread flat across the rotting oak of the cataloging table, the profound visual revelation of what it actually was struck Alaric with the forceful, dizzying impact of a physical blow to the chest. This was absolutely unequivocally not a scholarly work of theological contemplation, nor was it a piece of forgotten poetic marginalia. The surface of the parchment was an absolute, chaotic mess of entirely practical, horribly worldly stains, the dark, purplish, overlapping rings of spilled, cheap tavern wine, the faded, deeply set rust-brown flecks that his mind immediately, uncomfortably categorized as dried human blood, and the completely unmistakable, raised, white, crusty rime of repeatedly evaporated sea salt. The lines heavily drawn upon the abused surface were absolutely not the confident, sweeping, aesthetically perfect strokes of a master illuminator guided by divine inspiration, but rather the jagged, hasty, desperately utilitarian scratches of a desperate man trying to accurately capture physical reality before the unforgiving world managed to kill him. Alaric leaned in closer, his breath hitching in his constricted throat as his expertly trained eyes began to trace the erratic, twisting geography depicted in the crude, heavy charcoal and cheap fading ink. He recognized the shape almost instantly, a jolt of pure, electrifying recognition shooting through his nervous system. It was the vast, plunging southern reach of the African continent, the jagged, unforgiving coastline meeting the boundless, terrifying expanse of the surrounding ocean. This was the exact, identical territorial expanse he had just spent 3 exhausting, painstaking weeks illuminating on his own massive, definitive masterwork in the scriptorium above. Yet the paralyzing shock came not from the recognition of the location, but from the horrifyingly immense discrepancy in its fundamental depiction. Where his own magnificent, doctrinally approved map boasted a terrifying, multi-headed demonic hydra writhing violently in churning, highly stylized vortexes of abyssal blue and seafoam white, carefully bordered by strict ecclesiastical warnings of boiling, impassable oceans and waiting apocalyptic leviathans, this rough, battered chart showed something completely, horrifyingly mundane. Alaric's trim.
Moving his gaze toward the bottom edge of the parchment near the depiction of a small, distinctly prosperous-looking trading outpost, a thriving settlement that strict ecclesiastical geography stubbornly insisted absolutely could not exist in the supposedly scorching, demon-haunted, uninhabitable equatorial torrid zone, Alaric found a block of scrawled, messy text.
The words were written in a highly bastardized, terribly phonetic, barely legible Latin hand, clearly the work of a man who knew the practical sounds of the language for trade, but possessed absolutely no formal education in its complex, rigid grammar. Alaric's pale lips moved silently, forming the crude words in the dim, dusty air as he slowly parsed the incredibly rough, unrefined sentences. Transitus tutus, bonum commercium cum Saracenis. Safe passage, good trade with the Saracens. The singular, incredibly mundane word safe struck the devout cartographer with the devastating, earth-shattering force of a theological earthquake. Safe? How could any passage possibly be safe in the absolute, undisputed realm of the demonic Leviathan, at the very edge of God's ordered, moral universe? Suddenly, a profound, agonizingly intense episode of cognitive dissonance seized Alaric's mind, forcing a terrifying split-screen effect upon his intensely visual imagination. On the left side of his mind's eye, his own magnificent, deeply beloved map blazed in perfect radiant clarity, a breathtaking, monumental testament to the Church's cosmic moral order, flawlessly rendered in impossibly expensive crushed lapis lazuli, vivid vermilion, and flawlessly burnished gold leaf, meticulously detailing a highly structured world where terrifying divine monsters righteously punished the wicked, and the terrifying edges of the earth belonged solely to God's immense, unknowable wrath. On the right side of his vision, sharply contrasting this divine perfection, was the ugly, physical reality currently resting in his trembling hands, a ragged, worldly, desperately stained piece of dead, flaking animal skin that boldly, casually claimed the terrifying apocalyptic unknown was simply another perfectly navigable place for ordinary men to buy, sell, and merely exist. This forced juxtaposition tore at the very foundational seams of Alaric's deeply structured world-view, plunging him instantly into a profound, terrifying philosophical crisis regarding the true nature of his life's vocation. What, he suddenly wondered with a creeping, icy dread, was the actual fundamental purpose of a map? Was it meant to be a strict moral compass, a beautiful, terrifying theological tool designed specifically to reflect the Creator's moral universe and keep simple men appropriately fearful and strictly obedient to the Church? Or was it supposed to be a literal, physical reflection of the actual dirt, rock, and water of the tangible earth, utterly devoid of any inherent morality or divine intervention? He was suddenly struck by the horrifying, blasphemous thought that if this crude, practical tool was genuinely accurate, and its very existence complete with incredibly specific depth soundings and complex wind charts strongly suggested it had been used repeatedly and successfully by living men, then the grand, celebrated maps of the Church were nothing more than incredibly beautiful, highly elaborate, deliberate fictions. The realization that the world as it truly is, and the world as it is drawn by the holy, educated brothers in the scriptorium, might be two entirely separate, utterly irreconcilable realms, made him feel physically nauseous, as if the solid stone floor beneath him had suddenly turned to empty, terrifying air. Unbidden, a vivid, incredibly detailed vision of the anonymous phantom sailor who authored this practical heresy materialized in Alaric's distressed mind. He imagined a rough, brutally pragmatic man of relentless action, a survivor with tough skin turned to thick, unyielding leather by the
As this realization fully settled in his chest, a sudden, icy, suffocating wash of sheer terror and profound, paralyzing guilt completely flooded Alaric's system. The stark realization of the immense, undeniable heresy he was currently holding casually in his hands tightened his throat until he could barely draw breath. To merely possess this forbidden document, to even briefly entertain the blasphemous notion that the Church's strictly dictated geography was inherently flawed and deliberately deceptive, was a mortal sin of the absolute highest, most unforgivable order.
It was the ultimate sin of pride, the deeply corrupting sin of questioning the divine authority of the abbots and the Pope himself. The previously comforting, familiar shadows of the dusty, neglected archive suddenly seemed to actively lean toward him, twisting into menacing, elongated forms that felt terrifyingly alive and fiercely judgmental. He felt the sudden, oppressive, agonizingly heavy weight of unseen eyes boring into his rigid back, convinced that the very stones of the monastery were silently bearing witness to his profound spiritual treason. His physical reaction to this sudden, overwhelming fear was immediate and entirely uncontrollable. Alaric's heart began to race wildly, hammering against his ribs with the frantic, terrified rhythm of a trapped, desperate bird trying to escape a cage. The heavy, absolute silence of the subterranean monastery, which only moments ago had felt like a peaceful tomb, now felt incredibly oppressive, ringing loudly in his sensitive ears. He strained his hearing desperately, listening with agonizing intensity for the dreaded sound of heavy booted footsteps echoing on the distant stone stairs, terrified that an inquisitor or the severe abbot himself was already marching down to severely punish his profound transgression. The single flickering flame of his nearby stubby candle seemed to sputter and dance aggressively, mirroring the sudden violent tempest raging within his own tortured soul, casting frantic, wildly elongated shadows across the vaulted stone ceiling that looked exactly like grasping demonic claws. He felt profoundly, intensely isolated, entirely and completely severed from the comforting, predictable rhythm of the monastic hours and the safety of his ignorant brotherhood, forever separated by the horrifying, undeniable truth of the secret now resting heavily in his trembling, ink-stained hands. In that terrifying moment of absolute panic, pure survival instinct violently overrode decades of strict, unyielding theological conditioning. He did not immediately do what a good, obedient monk should do. He did not furiously tear the blasphemous, heretical chart into 1,000 tiny, unreadable pieces. He did not immediately hold the thick parchment to the sputtering candle flame to let the purifying, holy fire consume the sailor's dangerous, undeniable truth and turn it to innocent ash. Instead, with violently trembling, incredibly frantic fingers, he quickly folded the stiff, resistant parchment back down into its small, entirely inconspicuous original square shape. He cast a highly nervous, terrified glance frantically over his shoulder into the deep, pooling gloom of the archive, verifying his absolute solitude, knowing that this single deliberate action marked the irreversible crossing of a profound moral threshold. With desperate speed, he violently thrust the folded chart deep inside his heavy, dark woolen robes, sliding it awkwardly past his rough rope cincture, forcefully pressing the rough, scratchy, salt-stained vellum directly against his thin linen undertunic, positioning it directly over his rapidly beating, terrified heart. As he stood absolutely frozen in the tenebrous, overwhelming gloom of the dusty, forgotten archive, Alaric knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that he was fundamentally, irreversibly changed. The hidden chart burned hotly against his chest like a physical sear.
Chapter 4. Gramatyka strachu.
The sailor's map, that seemingly insignificant, sea salt-stained piece of parchment that, contrary to all laws, divine and human, showed lands where there should have been only emptiness, haunted Alaric like a malicious, relentless specter, creeping into every crevice of his analytical mind and brutally poisoning his previously rigorous peace of mind. This scriptorium, which until recently had been an absolute sanctuary for him, a place where he believed he was communing with the pure, untainted truth about the structure of the world, suddenly began to remind him of a carefully constructed cage in which each monk was just a blind tool in the hands of a higher, invisible power.
He began to look at his own many years of work, as well as at the meticulous work of his brothers in the faith, with completely new, disturbingly critical eyes that were finally stripped of the veil of dogmatic delusion. The sound of dozens of goose feathers methodically scraping against the rough surface of stretched vellum, which he once associated with a soothing, prayerful whisper, now sounded to his ears like an organized, mechanical process of mass falsification of reality, in which every coastline was a lie and every drawn monster was a guardian of this deception. He watched Brother Thomas, with reverent, almost fanatical reverence, put the finishing touches on the gilding around the winding tentacles of the sea leviathan off the coast of the supposed inaccessible terra incognita, and he felt a choking cold lump in his throat as he realized that this monster did not come from any authentic, reliable accounts of travelers, but was merely an echo of long-established, preconceived notions designed to maintain the status quo. The gold leaf that his brother applied with such mathematical precision did not serve to emphasize the infinite glory and diversity of God's creation, but was intended to dazzle, confuse, and ultimately intimidate the viewer's eye, masking the total lack of reliable geographical knowledge under a thick cloak of rich, almost hypnotic ornamentation. Alaric, secretly from everyone, began to analyze every brushstroke of his unsuspecting companions, every tiniest drop of precious cinnabar and lapis lazuli imported from afar, seeing in them no longer an inspired act of creativity, but a rigorous duplication of ancient patterns that were born out of calculation. He already knew that curiosity, that cursed seed of rebellion, had sprouted within him and would not rest until he unraveled the mystery of the origins of these nightmarish visions that had imprisoned humanity within the confines of the known world for centuries. The decision was made in the silence of his own cell, and amid sleepless nights spent staring at the cracks in the stone ceiling, he had to descend into the depths of the monastery archives and begin his secret, dangerous investigation, away from the judgmental eyes of his superiors, in search of the roots of this omnipresent lie. Under the cover of the thick, impenetrable night, when the only sound in the mighty abbey was the steady, distant ticking of the water clock and the howling of the wind in the turrets, Alaric slipped from his cell to wander like a ghost through the icy stone corridors leading to the library. A cavernous library, resembling the interior of some ancient beast, a place that during the day he had considered an infinite source of revealed, absolute truth, now bathed in darkness, appeared to him as a gigantic repository of hidden clues, a huge collection of clues waiting for someone who would dare to ask the right questions. The air in this place forgotten by time was extremely thick, even suffocating, filled with the heavy smell of crumbling parchment, drying bookbinding glue, the smell of dog fat from rarely lit candles, and the inevitable smell of slow decay that touched even the most sacred texts. Alaric, with his hands trembling with excitement and cold, lit just one wax candle, whose meager, quivering flame dispersed. With a fascination that slowly turned into a cold in his veins, Alaric realized that these map monsters, these supposedly demonic beings, were not at all the pure, unrestrained fantasy of joyful artists, but were a grotesquely amplified, distorted echo of reality, an evolution of error and fear that took on a physical, graphic form. He realized that the forms of these monsters, their specific attributes, sharp claws, multiple heads, scaly backs, were not accidental at all, not the result of artistic whim, but a deep-rooted, purposeful structure, something he began to mentally call a terrifying grammar of fear, a system of signs designed to evoke specific emotional reactions.
He observed how this specific grammar operated on the imagination, how it combined elements of known predators, lions' mouths, eagles' claws, snake coils, into hybrids that subconsciously touched on humanity's oldest, most primal fears of being devoured, of dying in agony, of what lurks in the darkness beyond the light of the fire and the boundaries of the known Christianized oikoumene. Each claw, each terrifying multiple eye peering out from the dark areas of the map, acted as a letter in a powerful dark alphabet of discouragement. This language, though mute and voiceless, was read with terrible clarity by every illiterate sailor and every proud monarch, communicating directly and without beating around the bush one essential truth: don't go there. He realized that those who designed these visual nightmares were not merely naive copyists, but masters of a specific brutal language, a language whose primary purpose was deterrence, to build psychological walls far more durable than those of stone and mortar, walls built of pure manufactured terror, designed to keep people from venturing into the unknown and questioning the established world order. Cartographers, with brushes in their hands instead of swords or axes, thus defended the boundaries of contemporary knowledge, forging invisible shackles that prevented the human mind from exploring and discovering the truth about the shape and size of the earth, effectively perpetuating a dogmatic balance of power that favored those who controlled information. This discovery turned Alaric's entire life into ruins. Suddenly, he felt like a prison guard who had been unknowingly sharpening the bars for years, locking his neighbors in a cell of ignorance, while he himself considered himself a servant of light and spiritual progress. However, now he opened his eyes and noticed the bars made of paint and gold, perpetuating the state of permanent suspension of minds in a false and limitless safe universe. To confirm his revolutionary and potentially blasphemous theory, Alaric had to go a step further. He knew that biology was only one source of this visual vocabulary, so he decided to cross his existing natural discoveries with the most powerful and influential texts the monastery possessed, with the theological manuscripts that defined the moral and spiritual universe of medieval man. In a quick, almost frantic movement, he pushed aside the suddenly outdated works of Pliny and began to pull from the highest, most guarded, and rarely visited shelves the most magnificent, most richly illuminated copies of the Book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of St. John, and the early, extremely evocative treatises on the nature of hell, including those that drew on terrifying, visionary images reminiscent of the torments of Dante's Inferno. In the light of a single, erratically flickering candle, these majestic, heavy volumes, full of theological fury, came to life in an eerie, even ghastly way. Thick layers of carved gold leaf, which theoretically symbolized the pristine divine light, now sparkled sinisterly next to patches of the deepest ruby reds, cobalt blues shining like...
Chapter 6. The Cosmological Cage.
Uciekając przed echem tamtej wstrzasającej rozmowy, Alaric szukał schronienia w jedynym miejscu, które zawsze oferowało mu bezwarunkowy azyl, w mrocznym, chłodnym skryptorium. Ciężkie dębowe drzwi zamknęły się za nim z głuchym rozkotem, odcinając go od reszty klasztornego świata, ale nie od własnych galopujących myśli. Powietrze tutaj było gęste, przesiąknięte ostrym zapachem atramentu dębowego, stechlego pergaminu, topniejącego wosku pszczelego i wilgotnego kamienia, z którego wzniesiono te starożytne mury. Sklepienia krzyżowe tonęły w nieprzenikniałym mroku, a jedynym źródłem światła była samotna, gruba świeca, którą zapalił drżącymi dłońmi. Jej płomień tańczył nerwowo, rzucając na ściany wydłużone, groteskowe cienie, przypominające dramatyczne kompozycje z obrazów mistrzów światłocienia. To właśnie w tej grze światła i ciemności, w tym surowym, niemal gotyckim otoczeniu, Alaric próbował uspokoić bicie własnego serca. Czuł się tak, jakby mury klasztoru nagle zaczęły się na niego zaciskać, a powietrze stawało się coraz rzadsze z każdą kolejną sekundą. Skryptorium, jego ukochana świątynia sztuki i wiedzy, nagle wydała mu się obca, pełna niewypowiedzianych tajemnic i ukrytych w cieniu zagrożeń. Każdy pulpit, każdy kalamarz, każdy starannie oprawiony manuskrypt zdawał się teraz milczącym świadkiem jego narastającego przerażenia. Przez lata wierzył, że to miejsce jest twierdzą prawdy, bastionem światła w świecie spowitym mrokiem ignorancji. Teraz jednak, z umysłem wciąż wibrującym od herezji, które przed chwilą usłyszał, zaczął dostrzegać w tych ścianach coś zgoła innego, architekturę kontroli, zaprojektowaną tak, by ograniczać, a nie wyzwalać. Szedł powoli między rzędami pulpitów, a jego kroki odbijały się głuchym echem od kamiennej posadzki, potęgując poczucie całkowitego osamotnienia w obliczu prawd, które powoli zaczynały burzyć fundamenty jego dotychczasowego świata. Cienie wydawały się mieć własną wolę, pełzając po regałach niczym złowrogie byty żywiące się jego narastającym zwątpieniem. To fascynujące, jak szybko poczucie bezpieczeństwa może przerodzić się w klaustrofobię, gdy tylko zmienimy perspektywę zaledwie o ułamek stopnia. Alarik zacisnął powieki, próbując wyrzucić z pamięci słowa, które zasiały w nim to trujące ziarno, ale one tylko przybierały na sile, rezonując w jego czaszce niczym odrzenia wielkiego dzwonu na wieży katedralnej. Z każdym oddechem wciągał w płuca zapach własnego dziedzictwa, zapach stuleć ślepego posłuszeństwa, które teraz dławiło go niczym fizyczna obręcz zaciśnięta na gardle. Zbliżył się do swojego stanowiska pracy, gdzie na pochyłym blacie z ciemnego drewna spoczywał zwinięty w rulon pergamin. Była to klasyczna mapa typu TO, arcydzieło średniowiecznej kartografii, jakiego uczono go rysować od pierwszych dni spędzonych w terminie u mistrza iluminatora. Z ciężkim sercem i dłońmi, które wciąż odmawiały mu pełnego posłuszeństwa, rozwiązał rzemień i ostrożnie rozwinął arkusz, przyciskając jego krawędzie ołowianymi ciężarkami. Sztywny, doskonale wyprawiony pergamin cielęcy wydał przy tym cichy, suchy trzask, który w absolutnej ciszy skryptorium zabrzmiał niczym wystrzał. Powierzchnia mapy, gładka i lśniąca, była pokryta precyzyjnie wykreślonymi liniami, tworzącym obraz świata, który przez całe życie uważał za absolutny i niepodważalny. Świat był na niej idealnym, zamkniętym w sobie okręgiem, literą O, reprezentującą wszechocean, oceanus, otaczający całą zamieszkaną ziemię, niczym nienaruszalny mur z wody. Wewnątrz tego okręgu wpisana była litera T, formowana przez 3 wielkie akweny na dnie, Morze Śródziemne jako pionową linię oraz rzeki Nil i Don, tworząc linię poziomą. Ten prosty, geometryczny podział kategoryzował świat na 3 znane kontynenty: Azję na górze, Europę w lewym dolnym rogu i Afrykę w prawym dolnym. Kiedyś ten widok napełniał go głębokim pokojem, poczuciem, że wszechświat jest miejscem uporządkowanym, logicznym i pełnie zrozumiałym, stworzonym przez architektora o nieskazitelnym.
Chapter 7. A Pattern of Lies. Alaric's transformation from a meticulously obedient illustrator of holy texts to a clandestine investigator of monumental heresies was not marked by a sudden, violent epiphany, but rather by the slow, agonizing erosion of his foundational beliefs, a crumbling of the very theological bedrock upon which his entire life's work had been built. His clandestine mission within the labyrinthine walls of the ancient monastery was no longer driven by the idle, innocent curiosity of a scholar seeking divine truth in the forgotten margins of the world, but by a desperate, gnawing hunger to uncover the full, terrifying scope of the deception he had unwittingly helped to perpetuate for years. He was consciously embarking upon a new, infinitely more dangerous phase of his research, stepping over the threshold of blind obedience into the perilous realm of institutional treason.
To breach the inner sanctum of the monastery's most heavily guarded secrets, he had meticulously concocted a pretext, a lie so perfectly tailored to his master's insatiable greed that it would entirely bypass their usual paranoid suspicions. He had formally and publicly petitioned the austere Brother Anselm, the famously rigid keeper of the keys, for emergency nocturnal access to the restricted archives, citing an urgent, divinely inspired need to consult the ancient, crumbling treatises on the chemical preparation of rare pigments. He argued with feigned passionate devotion that expertly masked his racing pulse that the magnificent and unprecedented commission for the wealthy Signore Vivaldi required a specific, long-lost binding agent for the lapis lazuli and vermilion, a secret alchemical formula rumored to be hidden within the rotting, locked vaults of the old scriptorium. The lie was a masterstroke of psychological misdirection, playing directly upon the abbot's ravenous desire for unparalleled artistic perfection that would permanently secure Vivaldi's incredibly lucrative patronage. Now, as the heavy midnight bell tolled from the highest tower, sending mournful, bone-rattling vibrations through the freezing stone floor of the empty cloisters, Alaric stood completely alone in the suffocating darkness of the subterranean corridor. The visual atmosphere surrounding him was a study in absolute oppressive claustrophobia, a scene ripped straight from a dark, brooding masterpiece of Caravaggio's Chiaroscuro. The flickering, dying flame of his heavily shielded lantern cast long, monstrous shadows that seemed to writhe and violently dance along the damp, nitrate-stained walls, while the deep, inky blacks of the unlit corners threatened to swallow his fragile existence whole. Every shallow, terrified breath he took materialized as a ghostly plume of white mist in the frigid, stagnant air, providing a stark, chilling contrast to the deep, saturated crimson of his heavy woolen robes, marking him as a solitary point of nervous, pulsating life in a massive stone tomb of forgotten, forbidden knowledge. The heavy oak door guarding the restricted archives loomed before him like the formidable gate of an ancient fortress, its surface deeply scarred by centuries of time and reinforced with thick blackened iron bands that spoke of a paranoia deeply ingrained in the monastery's history. Alaric set his lantern down upon the cold flagstones, ensuring the metal shield was angled to cast only the narrowest possible sliver of amber light upon the massive iron locking mechanism. His heart was hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm against his ribs, a physical manifestation of the immense risk he was taking. Discovery here, in the dead of night, with lock-picking tools in hand, would mean immediate excommunication, imprisonment in the subterranean cells, or a far darker, quieter fate orchestrated by the abbot's loyal enforcers. From the deep pockets of his robe he withdrew a small leather-bound roll of delicate steel instruments, tools he had meticulously fashioned over the past.
Chapter 8. The Abbot's Shadow.
From the gloom of the upper cloister, shrouded in inky shadows and thick, impenetrable darkness, Abbot Theron's eyes followed every movement in the courtyard below, like the gaze of a bird of prey circling its unsuspecting prey. The architecture of the monastery, once a symbol of divine order and spiritual refuge, was now an intricate chessboard in his mind on which a silent, dangerous game was being played. The moonlight shining through the narrow Gothic stained-glass windows cast elongated, razor-sharp shadows on the stone floor, creating a visual spectacle straight from Caravaggio's darkest canvases. In this sea of darkness and sporadic, dramatic shafts of light, the figure of Brother Alaric stood out with disturbing clarity. The young monk slunk under the arches with a nervousness that betrayed his guilt, and each step, though deliberately muted, resonated in the abbot's alert mind like the tolling of a bell. Theron didn't need to see the parchments hidden under Alaric's robe. The young man's very posture, his hunched shoulders and wandering eyes, screamed of betrayal, of heresy,
of secrets that should never see the light of day. The abbot, standing absolutely still, resembled an ancient stone gargoyle whose sole purpose was to guard the walls against corruption from the outside, but above all against the rot growing within. The deep crimson and cobalt reflections from the stained glass windows danced across his stern face, highlighting the deep grooves carved by years of fanatical discipline and ruthless suppression of any insubordination. There was no anger in his eyes, but an icy, calculating awareness that the young researcher had touched forbidden knowledge, knowledge that could shake the very foundations of their faith and lead to a disaster of unimaginable proportions. Theron knew he couldn't strike immediately. He had to corner his prey first, tighten the loop of paranoia and fear until Alaric himself made a mistake that would cost him everything, from his position in the Order to the eternal damnation of his immortal soul. For Alaric, the monastery, which for years had been his only home, a sanctuary of knowledge and an oasis of peace, had turned into a dark, claustrophobic labyrinth where every stone seemed to have eyes, and every gust of wind carried muffled whispers of accusations. The air, once filled with the calming scent of old beeswax, dried herbs, and ancient parchment, now choked him, taking on the metallic, heavy aroma of fear and the approaching storm. The walls of cut stone that had protected him from the harshness of the outside world seemed to tighten around him with each passing day, pulsing with an invisible, sinister life. Alaric began to obsessively analyze his every move, every gesture, and every word he said in the presence of his fellow brothers, fearing that any careless detail would betray his growing fascination with the forbidden archives. He noticed how the shadows in the corridors lengthened unnaturally, creating the illusion of hooded figures following him at every step, and the simple creaking of the oak doors sounded to his ears like a sentence of damnation. This mounting paranoia was like a slow poison seeping into his bloodstream, distorting his perception of reality and making even the most trivial events take on a sinister significance. He could feel Abbot Theron's eyes on him, even when the old man wasn't around. That intangible but overwhelming feeling of being watched that crept under his skin, causing him to wake up at night in a cold sweat, his heart racing. The golden and red illuminations on the pages of manuscripts that he had once admired with reverence now reminded him of open, bleeding wounds, and the images of saints seemed to look at him with condemnation, rejecting him as a heretic and a traitor. Each ring of the monastery bell measured not the time of prayer, but the time left to be.
Chapter 9. Confrontation in the Shadow of the Altar. Abbot Theron's threat, uttered only a few hours earlier in a quiet but unconscionable tone, still vibrated in the stale, cold air of Alaric's cell, like the dull toll of the Vespers bell, its ominous echo within the stone walls refusing to fall silent for anything in the world. These words, instead of finally paralyzing the young monk and forcing him back into the framework of blind obedience to which he had been trained for years, had a completely different effect, like tinder hitting steel over a pile of dry tinder, igniting in his pained interior a powerful, consuming fire of rebellion, the existence of which he had never even suspected in his own soul. He sat on the edge of his hard, uncomfortable bunk, staring unseeingly at the single, uneven flame of a tallow candle, which cast grotesque, dancing shadows on the rough, damp walls, resembling the same monsters of the deep sea that he himself had painted with such pedantry and care on the edges of the official parchments. He knew now, with an absolute, crystalline certainty that was as liberating as it was terrifying, that he could no longer live in this lie, that he could no longer continue to exist in the safe but suffocating darkness of ignorance, while the truth about the shape of the world and the cynical manipulations of his superiors pulsated under his fingers like living, bleeding tissue.
The decision to directly, openly confront Theron, the man who had almost absolute power over his life, soul, and body, had not come easily. It had been born of pain, born of sleepless nights, theological dilemmas, and the burning sense of betrayal of everything he believed in. But now that it had been made, it was as hard and irreversible as the sentence of the Inquisition. Alaric felt the physical fear that had previously clamped icy fingers around his throat and made his heart beat in an uneven, frantic rhythm, slowly but surely transform into cold, calculating determination, the kind of desperate courage that only appears when a man realizes that he has absolutely nothing left to lose, and that the only way to save his immortal soul is uncompromising standing up for the truth, regardless of the earthly consequences. The process of collecting physical evidence of his heresy, or rather the heresy of the order itself, was reminiscent of a convict's preparation for his final journey, each move marked by extraordinary, almost ritualistic attention and anointing, as if these objects had suddenly acquired a sacred character, becoming relics of a new, dangerous religion of objective truth. His slim fingers, stained by years of ink use, trembled noticeably as he reached for a hidden hiding place under a loose stone in the floor of his cell, from where he reverently extracted first the rough, sea-salted and time-worn parchment of a sailor, the same one that had started the whole avalanche of his doubts, a map so different from the tidy masterpieces full of false theology that came out of their scriptorium, a map dirtied with sweat, blood, and dust, but terrifyingly, painfully true. Then, with even greater care, he began to roll his own secret notes into tight rolls, sheets covered with tiny, nervous writing, in which with mathematical precision, worthy of ancient Greek geometers, he correlated the occurrence of alleged bloodthirsty leviathans and deadly whirlpools with the most lucrative, spice and silk-rich trade routes of the East, creating a ruthless, logical chain of clues, from which there was no escape. At the very end, his heart pounding against his ribs so hard that he feared the sound would alert the guards patrolling the night's corridors, Alaric pulled out his opus magnum, a large map secretly created over the course of months, on which, using the most expensive pigments stealthily looted from the scriptorium's reserves, he had plotted the final, revealing image of the world, a grid of everything.
Chapter 10. The Terrible Necessity.
Alaric's voice, until this point resonating with the absolute, unyielding clarity of anger and sense of justice, finally broke, then died completely, disappearing into the oppressive, cavernous silence of the abbot's private study. The young monk exposed every tiniest, treacherous detail of the conspiracy, throwing it on the table like a bloody trophy, forged coordinates on secret navigation charts, the specific chemical composition of abyssal black ink used only in forbidden, deepest archives, fabricated accounts of sea monsters that coincided with unnatural, almost mathematical precision with the places of destruction of rival merchant ships, and finally the staggering, paralyzing scale of the global fraud that consumed his entire adult research life. He stood there, breathing heavily, his knuckles white with the effort of clenching that single incriminating piece of parchment, waiting in suspense for a violent outburst, for a terrifying display of ecclesiastical anger, perhaps for a desperate, pathetic denial from the unmasked old man, or at least for a frantic call for guards to drag out the impudent heretic. Instead, he was met with a reaction so deeply disturbing, so completely alien to his expectations, that it almost immediately began to dismantle his carefully constructed reality and sense of triumph. Abbot Theron was not furious. He didn't scream. He didn't shrink back in fear at the exposed truth. He didn't utter curses. This ancient man, resembling a sculpture carved in stone, sat behind his massive, deeply carved desk of blackened oak, bathed in a dramatic, merciless chiaroscuro reminiscent of Caravaggio's darkest works, generated by a single thick beeswax candle. The golden, shimmering light carved deep crater-like shadows across the abbot's wrinkled face, illuminating him starkly and terrifyingly in his absolute, almost inhuman stillness. The heavy crimson velvet of his robes seemed to absorb this scant light, creating around him an aura of condensed, suffocating power. The silence dragged on mercilessly, becoming a physical burden in the room, thick with the smell of burning wax, old library dust, and the metallic tang of growing fear. It was a silence that spoke louder than any scream, a calm, impenetrable emptiness that absorbed Alaric's explosive, passionate accusations without causing even the slightest wave of panic or concern to cross his superior's face. The deep, inky shadows of the room seemed to press inward, slowly suffocating the last remnants of the young scholar's defiant self-confidence, leaving him disoriented, trembling, and completely exposed to the terrifying calm of a man who, without blinking an eye, had orchestrated a lie that spanned the entire known world. When this murderous silence was finally broken, it was not with an angry roar, but with a sound far more devastating and destructive to Alaric's psyche. Abbot Theron simply sighed, a long, slow, deep exhale that seemed to carry the weight of centuries, the unimaginable weariness of a man who for too long had carried a burden that no one else even knew existed. And then, slowly, inexorably, in a way that was almost painful to watch, the corners of his mouth turned upwards, forming something like a smile. It was not a smile of mockery, arrogance, or triumphant malice, but an expression so tragic, so profoundly and hopelessly melancholy, that it sent a sharp shard of pure, paralyzing ice straight into Alaric's heart. "You are a genius, my son," Theron said, his voice a low, resonant growl that vibrated through the heavy wooden furniture and penetrated into the young monk's bones. The tone of that voice was...
Chapter 11. The Weight of the Quill.
The heavy, iron-studded oak door of the abbot's sanctum closed behind Alaric with a sound like the sealing of a monolithic tomb, a dull, terrifyingly resonant thud that seemed to vibrate aggressively through the very marrow of his bones and extinguish the last remaining embers of his childhood faith. He stumbled out into the dimly lit stone corridor, his physical movements entirely mechanical, the involuntary, uncoordinated spasms of a biological vessel whose animating spirit had just been violently excised. The monastery, an architectural marvel of vaulted ceilings and cloistered walkways that had served as his absolute sanctuary since his youth, now mutated before his disillusioned eyes into a grotesquely elaborate, nightmarish theater. The familiar scent of frankincense and myrrh, which for decades had reliably triggered a deep Pavlovian sense of divine comfort and spiritual elevation, now smelled acrid, cynical and choking, like the cloying perfume sprayed over a rotting corpse to mask the stench of systemic decay. The abbot's final, devastating words, "A necessary lie, Brother Alaric, to keep the fragile world from tearing itself apart in the dark," echoed and multiplied within the cavernous, newly hollowed-out spaces of his skull. The phrase bounced off the inner walls of his mind like a trapped, panicked bird, each collision leaving behind a smear of intellectual and theological blood. This was no longer merely a crisis of academic integrity or cartographic accuracy. It was a profound, apocalyptic spiritual annihilation. The foundation of his entire universe, built upon the supposedly unshakable bedrock of divine revelation and perfect truth, had just been revealed as a swamp of calculated geopolitical deceit. The soaring Gothic arches above him, designed to draw the humble eye upward toward the glory of the Almighty, now felt like the ribcage of a massive, predatory leviathan that had swallowed him whole, a beast constructed entirely of pious fictions and strategic manipulations.
As Alaric dragged his feet across the worn flagstones, every shadow cast by the flickering wall sconces seemed to stretch and contort into mocking, demonic shapes, laughing silently at the colossal, pathetic naivete of the master mapmaker who had spent his entire life charting a world that did not actually exist. As he continued his numb, agonizing descent through the labyrinthian corridors of the monastery, Alaric passed by several of his monastic brothers, men with whom he had shared countless silent meals, grueling midnight vigils, and joyous Easter celebrations. Brother Thomas, carrying a heavy stack of fresh linen, offered a warm, serene smile and a slight bow of his tonsured head. Brother Silas, his hands stained with the soil of the abbey's medicinal gardens, whispered a gentle, habitual blessing as they crossed paths. Alaric ignored them all, his eyes staring blankly through their solid forms as if they were mere phantoms, entirely incapable of returning their greetings or acknowledging their shared humanity. Their faces, illuminated by the warm, flickering glow of the passing torches, possessed an expression of pure, unadulterated, ignorant bliss that Alaric now found physically nauseating. He realized with a sickening lurch of his stomach that he was now separated from them by an unbridgeable, terrifying abyss of forbidden knowledge. They still lived within the warm, comforting embrace of the grand illusion, believing with every fibre of their being that the maps Alaric drew were literal transcriptions of God's perilous creation, that the monstrous sea serpents and boiling oceans he inked at the edges of the parchment were real, divine boundaries meant to keep righteous men safely within the fold of the Church. Listening to the distant, hauntingly beautiful Gregorian chants drifting up from the main chapel, Alaric experienced a violent cognitive dissonance. The intricate harmonies, once the very voice of angels descending from
Chapter 12. A Subtle Sedition.
The grey of dawn crept into Alaric's cramped cell like an unwanted, intrusive guest, mercilessly dispelling the thick, suffocating darkness of a sleepless night that had left a mark of extreme, paralyzing exhaustion on his body and mind. The young cartographer sat motionless on the edge of his hard straw mattress, his eyes fixed on one point on the bare stone wall, while his mind continued to writhe in the brutal grip of the moral dilemma he had been struggling with for the past dozen or so hours. He knew the consequences of open rebellion. He knew that refusing to obey the abbot's orders would inevitably lead to being accused of heresy, imprisonment in the dungeons beneath the monastery, and ultimately to a cruel death that would bring absolutely no benefit to the world. On the other hand, blind obedience, meekly drawing a false map that would deliberately lead the Genoese sailors to certain doom, was tantamount to a slow, irreversible suicide of his own soul and a betrayal of everything he believed in as a scientist and a man fascinated by the truth hidden in the world's geography. Staring at this slow, inexorable process of the birth of a new day, Alaric realized with terrifying clarity that he could not afford the luxury of being a martyr whose sacrifice would be immediately erased from the annals, nor could he become a helpless pawn in his superior's ruthless political game. The despair that had been suffocating him like a heavy leaden blanket all night slowly began to give way to a completely new, unfamiliar feeling, an icy, grim determination that sprouted in the deepest recesses of his pained mind, giving him the strength to make the only possible decision that would allow him to survive without completely losing himself. As the first pale ray of morning sunlight finally penetrated the narrow, barred window under the cell's ceiling, Alaric realized that he must forge his own uncharted path, find that legendary third way between the hammer of tyranny and the anvil of senseless death. He wasn't going to shout about his rebellion from the monastery walls. He wasn't going to throw a challenge in the abbot's face that would only end in his own destruction. But at the same time, he wasn't going to become a silent accomplice in the murder of hundreds of innocent sailors. The solution that came to his mind just before morning was brilliant in its simplicity and at the same time extremely dangerous in its subtlety. Involved the use of the only weapons at his disposal: ink,
a pen, and his extensive, secret knowledge of maritime navigation. He knew that the true power of the world did not rest in the hands of those who gave loud orders, but in the hands of those who silently drew lines on parchment, defining the boundaries of reality for everyone else. He began to mentally prepare for what had to come, planning in his head every single move, every line he would draw on the map, knowing that one slightest mistake, one nervous trembling of his hand, could unmask his elaborate plan and bring down the wrath of the mighty Abbot. With each breath of cool morning air, his fear transformed into focus and his sense of helplessness into a specific kind of inner power, and he realized that his silence would no longer be a sign of submission, but a powerful, camouflaged shield behind which he would hide his silent, murderous act of intellectual sabotage against the Abbot's plans. The path from his humble cell to the great scriptorium seemed endless that morning, and the corridors of the monastery were still shrouded in deep, almost palpable darkness, illuminated only by the sparsely placed extinguishing torches that cast trembling, grotesque shadows on the damp stone walls, reminiscent of nightmare apparitions. Alaric's every step echoed dully in the empty spaces, adding to the sense of isolation and loneliness that accompanied him.
Chapter 13. The Cartographer's Burden.
The journey through the labyrinthine, subterranean corridors of the ancient monastery felt less like a simple walk to the abbot's quarters and more like a solemn funereal procession toward the executioner's block. Alaric moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, his rough-hewn leather sandals slapping rhythmically against the cold, damp flagstones, a sound that seemed to echo with the terrifying finality of a heartbeat in the suffocating silence of the midnight hour. In his trembling, ink-stained hands, he carried a heavy, unyielding cylinder of aged vellum, a physical manifestation of his treasonous artistry and the culmination of weeks of agonizing, secretive labor. The darkness of the ecclesiastical halls pressed in around him, heavy and oppressive, pierced only by the intermittent, flickering glow of tallow candles mounted in rusted iron sconces. These solitary flames cast long, distorted, grotesque shadows that danced wildly upon the vaulted stone ceilings, making the statues of long-dead saints appear as though they were writhing in purgatorial agony, pointing accusatory fingers at the young cartographer. The familiar scent of melting beeswax, ancient decaying parchment, and the cold mineral tang of damp stone filled his nostrils, a sensory reminder of the vows he had taken and the sacred trust he was now systematically betraying. Alaric's internal monologue was a tempest of conflicting loyalties and terrifying hypothetical scenarios, a relentless philosophical debate regarding the absolute nature of obedience versus the profound, uncompromising necessity of truth. He reflected bitterly on the countless years he had spent walking these very same halls in a state of blissful, blind faith, a pious innocent entirely ignorant of the machinations of power. Now, the deep saturated crimsons and the rich celestial cobalt blues he had so painstakingly applied to the map were still vividly seared into his mind's eye, a beautiful, vibrant lie that he was about to present as infallible geographical doctrine. Every step forward was a step away from the light of divine truth and a deeper plunge into the murky, dangerous waters of human deceit, knowing that the rolled document in his hands possessed the power to shatter his entire world, condemn his immortal soul, and send him to the darkest, forgotten dungeons beneath the abbey, should his true intentions be discovered. Approaching the heavy oak door of Abbot Theron's private sanctum, Alaric felt a paralyzing wave of dread wash over his trembling frame. The timber was banded with thick, dark iron, studded with heavy rivets that looked like the unblinking eyes of a dozen silent sentinels guarding the threshold of absolute authority.
From within the chamber, the muffled, distinct sounds of administrative power bled through the thick wood. The sharp, rhythmic scratching of a heavy goose-feather quill against rough parchment, the rustle of shifting documents, and the slow, measured breathing of a man entirely comfortable in his absolute dominion. Alaric paused, his heart hammering against his ribs with the frantic, desperate energy of a trapped bird hurling itself against the bars of a cage. The hallway was bathed in a dramatic chiaroscuro lighting, a solitary pale shaft of moonlight piercing the gloom from a high, narrow window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the stagnant air, while the rest of the corridor remained submerged in impenetrable inky blackness. He raised a hesitant, shaking fist and knocked upon the ancient wood, the hollow, booming sound reverberating ominously down the empty corridor, effectively sealing his fate. The door creaked open, moving with an eerie smoothness on its massive hinges, revealing the opulent, shadowy interior of the abbot's quarters. This room was a stark, jarring contradiction to the strict monastic vows of poverty and asceticism. Immense bookshelves groaned under the immense weight of forbidden or hidden texts bound in exaic leather.
Chapter 14. The Language of Power.
Time did not merely pass within the heavy stone walls of the monastery's grand scriptorium. It accumulated, layering itself upon Alaric like the microscopic, inescapable dust of crushed lapis lazuli and pulverized gold leaf that settled irrevocably into the deep, permanent creases of his aging hands. The young, wide-eyed, and terrified monk who had once trembled at the sight of a poorly drawn coastline, whose heart had bled for the pure, unadulterated truth of the physical world, was entirely dead, buried beneath decades of calculated deception and masterful, world-altering artistry. In his place stood the senior cartographer of the realm, a man whose face had become a complex topography of its own, harsh, unyielding lines carved by the perpetual agonizing squinting against the flickering, inadequate glow of tallow candles, and deep, bruised shadows pooled beneath his eyes, perfectly mirroring the dramatic, inky blackness of the uncharted oceans he so frequently and maliciously conjured. His hair, once the color of rich, raw umber, had faded to the stark, unforgiving white of sun-bleached vellum, framing a face that rarely smiled, and when it did, it was a smile devoid of warmth, reflecting only a sharp, analytical amusement. This physical transformation, while profound and visible to all who feared and respected him, was merely a pale, superficial reflection of the devastating metamorphosis that had taken place within his soul. He moved through the world now with a slow, deliberate grace, the frantic, anxious energy of his youth replaced by the frightening, absolute stillness of an apex predator who has completely mastered his domain and knows the exact weight of his own authority. Every gesture was meticulously measured, every word weighed upon an invisible, unforgiving scale before being allowed to slip past his lips. He no longer saw the world as a beautiful, divine mystery waiting to be faithfully and humbly recorded. He saw it as raw, malleable clay, a pathetic, formless thing waiting to be forcefully shaped, constrained, and dictated by the precise strokes of his iron gall pen. The romantic, naive illusions of divine truth had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a cold, crystalline, and deeply cynical understanding of human nature and its insatiable, pathetic appetite for fear, myth, and control. As he stared out of the high, narrow-arched window, watching the shaft of pale, cold moonlight illuminate the chaotic dance of dust motes in the freezing air, Alaric recognized with a heavy heart that he had become the very architect of the world's ignorance, a title he bore with a complex, crushing pride that tasted constantly of ash, metallic ink, and raw power. The scriptorium over which Alaric now presided was no longer the cramped, freezing corner desk of a lowly novice, but a massive, cavernous hall of immense power and profound secrecy, a veritable factory where the political reality of the known world was forged in absolute silence. It was a space defined by the harsh, dramatic contrasts of light and shadow, reminiscent of a painting where the darkness is just as important as the illumination. Deep, cavernous shadows clung to the high, vaulted ceilings and lurked in the corners of the room, while isolated pools of intense golden candlelight illuminated the massive, sloping oak drafting tables where his apprentices labored under his terrifyingly strict supervision. The air was perpetually thick, heavily perfumed with the intoxicating, sharp scents of binding glue, damp leather, stale beeswax, and the sharp, acidic tang of the various chemical components used to create his legendary pigments. Shelves towering towards the heavens lined the walls, groaning under the immense weight of thousands of rolled parchments, massive leather-bound atlases secured with heavy brass clasps, and incredibly rare, forbidden texts smuggled from the far corners of the Ottoman Empire and the distant Orient. In the center of this magnificence,
Chapter 15. Poza krawędzią mapy.
The scriptorium was bathed in a thick, almost tangible darkness that seemed to have a life of its own, pulsating to the rhythm of the flickering flames of wax candles and casting long, quivering shadows on the raw stone walls, resembling the silhouettes of the damned contorted in pain. The air inside this vast, barrel-vaulted chamber was heavy, filled with the suffocating smell of old dried parchment, the pungent aroma of oak ink, animal bile used to bind pigments, and the smell of melted beeswax, all of which created a specific, almost sacred scent of the place. Old Alaric, his hair now dusted with the ashes of age, and his face lined with deep furrows that, like the rivers on his own maps, told the story of a long, mysterious life, sat on an elevated platform at the head of the hall, in the same massive, carved chair from which the late Abbot Theron had ruled all those years ago. As the decades passed, Alaric himself became what he once fought against so fiercely, albeit secretly. He became the guardian of the threshold, the supreme censor, and the final arbiter of truth and lies in a world imprisoned on flat sheets of calfskin. His hands, once so agile, precise, and capable of drawing the smallest, even microscopic details, hidden symbols and coded messages screaming freedom, now resembled the twisted, gnarled roots of old oak trees, disfigured by cruel rheumatism and marked with dark age spots. The pain in his joints was his constant companion, a constant reminder of the passing of time and that his own journey was coming to an inevitable end. Despite his physical infirmity, his mind was still razor-sharp, and his eyes, although hidden behind the dark curtains of droopy eyelids, could still detect the slightest twitch of the brush, the slightest deviation of the line, and the slightest error in the theological composition of the world. In those moments when the solitude of the scriptorium was at its most overwhelming, Alaric thought he saw in the darkest corners of the room the stern, implacable figure of Theron, whose spirit seemed forever trapped within those walls, still demanding obedience and the fear of the unknown that lurked just beyond the edge of the parchment. The sound of goose feathers scratching on the rough parchment resembled the steady, constant breathing of some huge, beastly creature, dormant for centuries, which now, in the absolute silence of the monastery walls, came to life to devour the remnants of human ignorance and replace it with dogmatic fear.
The new generation of young, extremely pious monks who now worked under Alaric's watchful though senile eye were radically different from the generation to which he had once belonged. These young boys, with their heads shaved into a perfect, smooth tonsure and their hands still untainted by self-doubt, drew terrifying sea monsters, leviathans, krakens, and horned beasts with the same religious, almost fanatical fervor that Alaric had displayed decades ago. Yet their fervor was devoid of that spark of rebellion, that subtle, hidden irony that had once fueled his own brushes. They believed in these monsters. They believed that just beyond the horizon, in the depths of unnamed waters, there lurked tentacles capable of crushing oak hulls and mouths ready to swallow the sinful souls of sailors. Alaric watched as they carefully applied the most expensive pigments imported from the farthest corners of the known world to the vellum. He saw how they reverently ground the blue lapis lazuli from the Far East in mortars, how they mixed bright blood-red cinnabar, and how, with trembling hands, they placed thin flakes of pure gold on the scales of dragons that were supposed to deter humanity from learning the truth. It was an irony so profound that it was painful for him, who had spent his entire life subtly undermining the cosmic order imposed by the Church, smuggling coded messages.